Good evening. The Serb generals have finally signed the terms under which they will pull their forces out of Kosovo. The news was broken in the last few minutes at the Macedonia air base where the talks were taking place by the British General Sir Mike Jackson.
I can confirm that General Mijanovic and General Stefanovic have signed the agreement on behalf of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and that I have signed on behalf of NATO. Under the terms of the agreement, once it has been confirmed to the Secretary General of NATO that the Yugoslav forces have complied with the initial withdrawal required of its forces from Kosovo, that he will direct the suspension of the airstrikes. I have made it clear that if subsequently the withdrawal timetable is breached, the agreement requires the air operation to resume. It is tragic that intransigence has made it necessary for the international community to resort to airstrikes in order to reach a settlement. However, NATO's resolve in conducting a sustained air campaign has finally achieved this agreement, and now is the time to look ahead.
Sir Michael Jackson. The agreement came after another day of drama and uncertainty at that camp in Kumanovo where the talks took place. Our correspondent Ben Brown reports from there.
As the sun was setting on the Kumanovo airbase, hopes of peace were rising steadily and dramatically. Talks that have been on again, off again all day were suddenly on again. First, the Serb delegates abruptly left and set off for Belgrade. Then, equally abruptly, they turned around and came back to the tent where they'd been talking for hour after hour to NATO's representatives. It seemed they had been given fresh instructions from Mr. Milosevic. Their about turn did undoubtedly represent a breakthrough.
Just to confirm that at 8:20 tonight, the NATO delegation led by General Sir Mike Jackson and the Yugoslav delegation led by General Mijanovic sat down to continue the face-to-face discussions that were suspended earlier on this afternoon.
The International Press Corps have been waiting since Saturday for these talks to produce a result. Originally, NATO said the Serbs had simply come here to sign a document on the military logistics of their retreat from Kosovo. Yet until tonight, the Yugoslav delegates had not put pen to paper. More and more, it had looked like they were stringing NATO along here, stalling and stonewalling, and cleverly playing for time. NATO sources here speculate the Serbs want that time, perhaps to cover up evidence of atrocities inside Kosovo, perhaps hoping that China and Russia will cause trouble for NATO at the United Nations. Despite all that, though, things do seem to be moving here tonight, and at least one key sticking point in the draft agreement has apparently been resolved. That stumbling block was about the way that NATO troops like these will go into Kosovo. The Serbs were worried that as they pull out their forces, there might be a power vacuum, leaving the rebels of the Kosovo Liberation Army free to terrorize Serbian civilians. Now it seems the Serbs have got guarantees on that, paving the way for a peace agreement at last. Ben Brown, BBC News, Kumanovo Airbase in Macedonia.
Well, as we know, that agreement has been signed within the last half hour, and Ben Brown joins us now. Ben, it's in the bag. What's the atmosphere there like?
Well, it's an atmosphere of jubilation on the part of NATO, I think one could fairly say. They called these meetings, these talks, to sign this, what is called this military technical agreement, back on Saturday. That's when the talks started. Now, then it was assumed that it would all go very quickly. The Serbs would simply turn up here, put pen to paper, sign this agreement, which is really essentially a logistical agreement about how they withdraw. But it's taken several days since then of arguing, of toing and froing, and although it was all supposed to be non-negotiable on NATO's part, NATO have clearly been to some extent if not negotiating, clearly discussing and doing a bit of give and take with the Serbs to allow this agreement to be signed. So I think the Serbs will feel they've got something out of it. They've shown that they're not withdrawing. They certainly haven't been humiliated in the sense they didn't just turn up and sign this document. They pushed for several days to get the terms that they wanted. Now, they haven't got those terms, but they have perhaps, you might argue, embarrassed NATO to the extent that they've drawn out these talks for quite a long period of time.
Then have they just disappeared into the night now, the Serbs, or are they likely to have their say before they go?
Well, they did make a brief statement. General Marjanovic, who was the leader of the Yugoslav delegation, he made a statement in which he basically said that the war is over, the war has ended, and that the policy of peace, in his words, of Mr. Milosevic is now in full swing. You can read that as you want it, but I think the words that the war is over are pretty significant, certainly as significant as the words of General Jackson. All the delegates have now gone off. General Jackson's just flown off in his helicopter away from this base, and what he has to do now is to move his troops very fast into Kosovo, and because the Serbs have made it clear they don't want any sort of power vacuum inside Kosovo in which the KLA rebels can take advantage. So British troops could be going into Kosovo within the next day.
Ben Brown, thank you. And our diplomatic correspondent Brian Hanrahan is with me. Brian, the troops clearly want to get in. They're champing at the bit. But is it as simple as that? There is a UN resolution to be got through, a bombing pause to be coordinated.
There is this sequence which has been worked out very carefully, and indeed one of the changes that were made today, one of the key changes that has enabled this to go through, is that they're going to be brought together very much more quickly than was originally planned. The troops, first thing that has to happen is Serb troops have to start moving out. Robin Cook, the Foreign Secretary, said once they have seen the trucks moving, they will be prepared to suspend the bombing. At that moment, that decision is taken by the Secretary-General of NATO. He phones Kofi Annan at the United Nations and says, I have stopped the bombing, I have suspended the bombing. And then Kofi Annan tells the UN Security Council, and with luck, the Security Council resolution is voted on tonight.
What finally unlocked this, in your view?
Well, I understand that there were one or two changes made in the course of the day, despite the lack of bargaining. But the one that apparently was worrying the Serbs most was what would happen if they reneged on the deal, if they didn't complete the timetable, if they didn't complete the withdrawal according to the timetable, what would happen? In other words, the bombing would start again. So they weren't happy. That sounded like a threat. So NATO took it out. That was the key thing that happened today. They took that threat out, which is probably why General Jackson, you heard him there in that...
He put it back in.
He put it back in. He said, if you don't keep the timetable, I'll start bombing you again. In other words, what they were saying was, this is always the threat. The fact it isn't in the deal doesn't make any difference. So that's why they were prepared to take it out.
Brian Hanrahan, thank you. Well, our World Affairs editor John Simpson joins me now from Belgrade. John, has news of the deal being signed reached Belgrade yet?
It hasn't, but everybody knew it was in the offing. I don't think anybody doubted the fact that it would be. And I think it was Ben Brown was saying a moment or two ago that it's indeed true. I think a lot of people here take a certain amount of pride in the thought that they've pushed NATO to the point where they had to give in on minor details, and they've simply been forced to carry on negotiating well beyond the deadline. I mean, it may be something of a Pyrrhic victory. It may not be a very important victory, but at a time like this, I think people do feel that they need something to cling on to. Now, of course, the big question here is what happens with President Milosevic, and I suppose the answer to that is that his problems are just starting to begin, because soldiers will come pouring back to barracks that don't exist because they've been bombed, to money which doesn't exist or has to be printed because the economy is in a frightful state, and simply a system where he's going to have to open it up to public discussion again because the wartime controls will go. I think his position is going to be tested very strongly.
And John, what sort of reception, briefly, are these troops who are pulling out of Kosovo, and heaven knows what sort of state some of them might be in? What sort of reception will they get when they come home?
Oh, I suppose a hero's reception. They must have been through a really terrible time, a lot of them, and I think they'll be received with great sympathy in the first instance. But, of course, there'll be men without jobs to go to. As I said, they won't have barracks to go to, and I dare say after a time people will come to resent them quite a lot. But in the sense that they're going back to their families and their friends, they'll be very much welcomed.
John Simpson, thank you. Well, the United Nations Security Council, as Brian Hanrahan just indicated, has begun meeting to discuss the resolution that will put the final rubber stamp on the end of the Kosovo conflict. Our UN correspondent Mark Devonpoint joins us from the UN's headquarters in New York. Is it as simple as that, Mark? Will it be a rubber stamp?
It's not quite as simple as that. The current meeting of the UN Security Council is discussing Kosovo. They're considering the long-term problems that will face the UN in rebuilding the infrastructure inside Kosovo and returning tens of thousands of refugees to their homes. But they're not expected to actually move immediately to a vote on this resolution. The reason is that there's still part of the sequence of events has to be completed. We still have to have phone calls saying that NATO has paused its bombing, and actually Western diplomats here say that they believe that will depend on the verification of a withdrawal, and the fact that it's night in Kosovo, it may well require daylight in Europe for NATO to verify that the Serb withdrawal has begun and then to call a bombing pause. So the best guess at the moment is that the actual vote on the resolution is likely to take place Thursday morning, New York time.
Mark Devonport, thank you. Well, the Defence Secretary, George Robertson, is in our Westminster studio now. Mr. Robertson, what's your reaction?
This is very important and very good news, which unlocks a process which hopefully will end the violence and see a verifiable withdrawal of the Serb troops. That will lead on, let us hope, to taking the refugees back. And what we must now do is make sure that we act now with the same resolution in getting the refugees back as we did in getting NATO's 5 key demands, which have now been enshrined in these agreements tonight.
And how long will it take to get the refugees back? Can they be back before the winter?
Well, we'll move the refugees back as quickly as humanly possible. And General Jackson, who broke the news tonight, who's been in charge of these detailed technical negotiations, the discussions that have taken over the last few days, is a man of courage and vision and clarity. His mission now is, with the same resolution that we and NATO have had during all of this time now, is to get the people back. With the violence over and the Serb troops out, I believe there's a new world there for the Kosovo refugees.
And will President Milosevic be pursued until you can get him into the dock?
Those who have been indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal have been indicted by a court of law and will eventually face justice. But the priority tonight is that we commit ourselves now to delivering on the promise we made to all of those refugees, that we will get them back in safety and security. And tonight's agreement unlocks a process in the next few days which will bring peace to a benighted part of our own continent.
Secretary of State, thank you very much.